So, James, I have some bad news. The NIMBYs have figured out how to use cutting-edge space technology.
Martin, this sounds quite scary because I've upset quite a lot of NIMBYs through my writing and this podcast over the years. And have they got missile technology now?
Let's hope not, but almost as bad. So James, I stumbled across a new pan-European NIMBY organization the other day, and it came to my attention when someone shared a Guardian article with about five different people in the byline, claiming that the UK is the fifth worst country in Europe for the loss of green space to development.
Well, I'm just glad to hear we're apparently back in Europe, Martin. So that's
Yeah,
nice.
it's lovely to be part of the conversation. Also, so fifth worst is just another way of saying top 20, James. I think we need to
Mm,
put a positive spin on these things. But anyway, the article is based on analysis of satellite imagery, and the claims that it makes are quite woolly.
mm.
So, in the Guardian's words, the UK ranks fifth if you're counting the highest proportion of green space compared to the geographic size of the country. But actually, Anna Clark, who writes about housing, points out that they seem to have misread the reports, and actually the UK is fifth in absolute terms. And listeners might be surprised to know that the UK is actually quite a big country. It's not as big as China or Canada or some of these young upstarts in the New World, but by European standards, we're actually quite large. So compared to someone like Portugal or Greece or the Netherlands, Belgium, Czechia, we actually have quite a large land area, and so it's not hugely surprising that we're using a lot more land for development. But if you look at it proportional to population, it turns out we're actually the fifth lowest for the proportion of green space use. So if anything, we're not actually using that much.
Martin, when you spoke about the New World, I could just picture you as like a foreign office aristocrat in the olden days, looking at a big world map with all the red bits coloured in, deciding the future of places you've never been to.
Oh, I used to draw those maps at school, James.
So, Martin, so does this mean we're using a surprisingly low amount of quote unquote green land for our population, whatever green means in this context?
Yeah. So exactly, we're actually quite low by European standards, which suggests that if anything, we're probably not building enough. But a bigger question here is how exactly are you defining these things in the first place? What even is Greenland, as Donald Trump was heard to ask in the first months of his presidency?
Okay, so this study, Martin, you mentioned it came from a pan-European NIMBY organization. Sounds quite ominous. Who are they and where do they come into this?
Yeah, so let's introduce the villains. So this article and several others in the same series, The Guardian, is the result of a collaboration between The Guardian and a journalism project called Green to Grey. And this is a group of journalists across Europe, supported weirdly by the Norwegian public broadcaster, the NRK, among others, and working in collaboration with the Norwegian Institutes for Nature Research, which slightly confusingly is called NINA. And we'll add a link to that in the show notes. But basically, the scientists at Nina have built this really cool app actually that uses
Mm.
AI to analyze satellite images of land across Europe and basically detect how much of that is being built on over time. So they're literally spotting the sort of slow march of grey across the countryside and seeing how that increments year after year. And they're using
Mm.
volunteers. This is a citizen science project as well. They're using volunteers through the app to help train the AI by looking at the images and marking the areas that have been developed.
I'm not going to lie, this is a very cool technology, Martin. I've seen this used in other contexts. I think corporations can use it to like monitor like farming and other sorts of land use. And there's loads of like industrial applications for this, all because of basically the cost of satellites falling, which is all very exciting. So yeah, this sounds cool. How are they misusing it, I guess?
Yeah, so it is a genuinely cool thing, and I think the data and the imagery that they're producing looks really interesting and useful. The problem is that the data is being interpreted by people who, let's be honest, really hate houses. I mean, apart from obviously the ones they live in personally. And so the articles that are being written on this are often sort of bizarrely wrong or poorly written or just massively biased because it turns out that interpreting satellite imagery is not as simple as is it green or grey.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of brown and sludgy colours in there as well. When I zoom in on Google Maps to try and work out what stuff is, it isn't always that easy. But again, even in terms of practical stuff, like we were talking about golf courses a moment ago. We talk about golf courses far too much on this show, but are they green? There's a lot of grass there, but they don't seem very natural. I mean, a lot of the people who go there, I think they're very unnatural.
Yes, we'll make a rural Shire man out of you yet, James. And it is remarkable just how much we end up talking about golf on this. I think probably for one special episode of the pod, we should actually just go and play golf and just see what this whole thing is about, since we apparently have dedicated half the country to it. So to give you another example from The Guardian, we've talked before about how if you want to drive to any sort of site on the HS2 route, you can basically just look in the satellite view on Google Maps, and there's like a big brown line across the country, like an alien just came and dragged a scrapey stick across it or something. And so the same project has been looking at images of the Chilterns from satellites and measured the brown area and decided that 252 hectares of green space has been lost there to HS2. But if you know literally anything about HS2, which you will if you're a subscriber to this podcast and you heard the episode we did a few weeks ago when I visited one of the sites, you'll know two things. Firstly, the earthworks are required in large part because locals wanted to reduce the impact on the landscape. So lots of this line is being buried in cuttings and tunnels and so on. And secondly, the vast majority of that 252 hectares that they're talking about is going to be regreened. And it's really funny reading the article because The Guardian kind of has to admit this. And it leads to this hilariously absurd bit where they're interviewing a farmer. And the farmer is pissed off because the train line is running through his fields. And basically, the land that HS2 are using, they're planting trees on it to help reduce the environmental impact. And the farmer's really angry about all these trees because he's worried they might make it harder to farm in the future.
So just to confirm that the official nature view of this, Martin, is that forests are bad and high intensity agriculture is good.
Yeah, exactly. It's absolute nonsense. It's literally farmers ranting about trees. And this, I'm going to call it field fetishism, this sort of absurd, idea that farmers' fields are somehow this kind of sacrosanct natural space. And it speaks, I think, to a larger problem with this project, which is that the people looking at these images, to be absolutely blunt, James, don't really seem to know what nature is or looks like. And I don't want to start ranting here, but this is something I've complained about before. And no offense to you or to other city dwellers, as we call them, but you get these overexcitable London people who basically never see the color green. They can go for days or weeks without experiencing nature of any kind. And they get a train out to Dunstable or Kent or Dorking one day, and they see a golf course or a managed forestry area or a field of wheat, and they go absolutely bonkers for it, despite the fact that all of these things are basically about as natural as my Jaguar, which, by the way, is also green.
I was beginning to worry that you hadn't mentioned your Jaguar for a while, just to make sure we are completely relatable to the audience.
Yeah. Well, unlike your electric scooter, I actually use my expensive toy, James. But if you go to the Green to Grey website, there's, again, this kind of unintentionally hilarious, dramatic slideshow that sort of opens the website. And the NIMBYs basically show pictures of what they think is nature being torn down by the evil capitalists. And literally almost none of it is nature. So they start with Greece. A forest on the coast is replaced by a hotel. And it's not a forest. It's like a little bit of scrubby coastal brushland in the middle of a town. There's roads and houses through it. And then it's just replaced with, quite a nice 5-star resort hotel, which, bearing in mind it's the Greek coast, not a huge surprise. And then it cuts to the UK. In the UK, fertile farmland. And they show a patch of basically dry brown field, which, like most monocultural crops in British farms, has basically no real wildlife value. And they're like, it's replaced with an Amazon center, which is great. We all need Amazon. We need, how else are we going to get Christmas presents this year, James? And the best thing is the Amazon center has even put a massive wildlife pond in, presumably for drainage purposes and so on, which is basically literally the best thing that you can do for nature. It's probably far more beneficial to the ecosystem than the entire site was before, just getting some water and some wetlands there. And then the best one of all, James, they moved to Germany, a lush pine forest, which is literally a high-intensity timber production facility. There's just roads cut through it, it's regimented, lines of pine trees that are obviously all going to get cut down for Christmas. There's nothing natural about it. And it's replaced with, horror of horrors, an electric car factory. So
No.
literally there's things that we're using to phase out fossil fuels.
Is this some sort of false flag operation on behalf of the
I
YIMBYs
know.
or something? It's like, what do they think about solar farms?
I'm sure they think they're an absolute nightmare. And this is really the tension because they're taking this kind of crazy, emotional, absolutist argument that basically all use of land that looks a little bit green is bad. And The Guardian at one point talks about protected natural land being replaced with concrete, bricks, and mortar. But neither of those things are actually true. Almost none of the examples they show are natural. And more than that, often what's built there is often better for the environment overall. So one of the sort of worst slash most hilarious articles in the series is about the Woodgate estate in West Sussex. God knows what the people did there to deserve being featured in this article and having like a Guardian writer come and interview them in the streets one weekend. But the headline describes this housing estate as like almost an apocalyptic event. It talks about a desecration of the landscape.
It seems almost like religious, I guess, in terms of how people talk about this. It's like there's no objective reality about like how we're actually using this, like you say, how land is actually being used or how useful it actually is to the natural environment. It's just sort of like a more of a theological commitment to something. It's green and therefore you should worship it.
Yeah, and it's insanely disproportionate language to use about what was basically some barren farmers' fields next to a motorway junction on the M23. And you can see from the satellite images they've kept the trees and the hedgerows intact. They've added wildlife ponds. Obviously, the houses themselves are built to 2020's standards, so they'll feature things like roosting spots for bats, bird boxes, hedgehog tunnels between gardens, and all that kind of good stuff. They're planting an orchard. They've built trails into the local woodlands for walking and cycling. This journalist interviews a woman called Sue, who she encounters on the estate, and is clearly like trying to get Sue to talk about, how terrible it is that houses have been built and so on. And Sue basically says, yeah, before this whole field was just mud used for a car boot sale on a regular basis. And now we have like orchards and woodland, and it's a beautiful place for children to play. And the whole article just kind of deflates midway through. And it's like, not only have you got more nature there, but you also have wonderful houses for people to live in. You've got a primary school, there's cycle paths, there's a community shop. It's a fantastic place, James.
I can sort of relate to this as a freelance journalist, Martin. Sometimes I've taken on a commission thinking, oh, I'll write about this. And then the story's sort of fallen apart and I'm thinking, oh, I still want my money. But what you described sounds lovely. Like, should I be on Rightmove after this? I'm going to go and have a look, I think.
It's quite tempting. If West Sussex was actually close to anywhere useful that I wanted to get to, I'd be very, very tempted. But like, if this is a bad development, if this is like literally a desecration of the United Kingdom, then what the hell does a good development look like? Which is kind of the point here. Essentially, no development is good. That's basically the theory here. All new housing should be stopped. And if that means people live in crappy, cramped conditions in incredibly expensive houses, then tough. But at least they could be honest and just admit that they hate all new housing instead of dressing it up as some kind of environmental satellite phrenology project, which is effectively what they're trying to do. It's infuriating, James.
I love the fact you've just coined the phrase satellite phrenology, Martin. I look forward to us being the only Google result for it.